small crowd today. Hi.
Hi, what are you doing?
Looking forward to meeting with you next week or
Yes,
whatever it
it's
is.
right.
Next
Yeah,
week.
it's Monday.
Monday,
Next
yeah.
Monday.
Yeah, it's coming up. Welcome. How are you guys today? You good? Okay, so I'm Steve Boone. I met you guys a couple of weeks ago as a moderator when Laura had to be somewhere else, and I got invited to actually participate today more as a presenter. Since I don't know much about this topic, we brought a real expert with us, Dr. Douglas Murphy, who, if you don't know Dr. Murphy is the Dean of the College of Health Professions and a former director of an Office of Educational Development sort of program, correct?
I wasn't the director, but
Worked in one anyway. So OED, the Office of Educational Development on this campus, is the group that sponsors the Ed Academy through academic affairs. So I'm happy to be here sort of as your MC and a little bit of a content person. The topic today, I guess I should have said that, go back. We wanted to talk a little bit about informal ways to assess learning. Most of us are pretty knowledgeable, I think, about formal mechanisms on to assess learning. I mean, how many tests have you taken in your life, right? I have no idea how many thousands of exams probably anybody in this room has sat through. That's an interesting question, actually. It's probably millions if you go all the way back to when you were a little kid and think about all the quizzes and everything that you've done. So we have a lot of experience probably in at least being the recipient of formal assessments, maybe not writing and drafting them. We're going to come back and talk about formal assessments down the road. I think that's in November in a few weeks. But what we don't seem to have as much experience in, or at least I didn't as an educator, was in how to do informal assessment. You guys all are learning or teaching in a variety of settings. There's lecture settings like this. I'm not going to call this a lecture setting. It's set up like a lecture hall, but it's really a relatively small classroom, right? And on this campus, you have places this size. You have people doing bedside teaching where there's 2, 3, 5 students at a time, 1 student at a time. You have people in the Sim Center doing all that kind of teaching, which is another environment to teach in. And then we have the gigantic lecture halls where we're all sitting there listening to people yap away for way too long usually. And then we have settings like the Active Learning Center in the library. All of those settings, as a skilled teacher, you want to be able to informally assess what's going on in those settings with your students. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today, are ways to do that. So the rationale for using informal assessments to gauge learning, we'll come back to all of these. Talk about some of the methods that people typically use. And we're going to do this in kind of an interactive way because the one thing that my experience anyway has taught me, there are formal approaches to informal assessment. There's also an awful lot of just seat of your pants learning that you gain by experience in the classroom. And what works for me in the settings I teach in may be totally different than what works for you in the settings you teach in, even if we teach in the same setting, because our own personal style of working with folks interacts in with that. We want to talk about some of the methods that can be used real time, because a lot of times in the classroom, what you're wanting to do is to get a handle on, are my students getting this? Are they getting it right now? Because if they're not getting it right now, and I only get to see them a very short period of their academic career or class, I want to know that so I can further explain. And we'll talk a little about those. You already know those. If you've stood in front of the class teaching, it's pretty obvious sometimes when people aren't getting it. I mean, everybody starts shopping on their computer. They start looking this like, the lights are on and nobody's home kind of look. Some of those kinds of things. So you know those things, but we're going to talk about that. There are also ways to go back after that learning event and see, did you get it? That are not the same as formal assessment like exams. We'll come back. We're going to look at some specific settings, and we want to talk a little bit about how to use these in sort of a formative and self-evaluation kind of framework. Questions? So see where we're sort of headed? All right, with that in mind, I had to go do a little bit of literature review. And one of my tasks for Dr. Murphy was to think about strategies and to look around for some descriptive materials about how to do this stuff. And so I had a lot of fun looking at videos of teachers from over the years, all searched under the how do you do assessment in your classroom and how do you utilize results of assessment in your classroom. So I want to start with something. I'm going to say this is probably from the dim ages, as you can tell from the quality of the video. It's at least from the dim ages. That's when I went to graduate school. It may be a little bit older than that. I think it probably is. I think you'll enjoy perhaps what we're seeing.
Mr. Grimes, mathematics teacher, is displeased with the progress of his ninth grade class in mathematics.
You see what low grades you made on your weekly mathematics test? More than half of you failed. Most of those who passed just got by. Nobody had 100%. This is the poorest class I've had in a long, long time. Most of you have no foundation at all. Now the trouble's with your attitude. You don't pay enough attention in class. You don't do enough work outside of it. You don't know what the word study means. You haven't the slightest idea. Don't you realize that mathematics is an important subject? I tell you right now that unless you get over your lazy habits and come up to the standards I've set for this class, many of you will have the pleasure of repeating this course next semester. Well, what is it?
Okay. Now, I'm going to be the first person to say, I'm certain nobody in this room has ever done that, right, to your students. I'm going to be the first person in the room to say, I hope nobody in this room has ever experienced that as a student, because that's pretty blatant, right? So what has he said? I set the objectives for you. I'm going to tell you what you have to learn. I used a formal method to see if you learned, right? And you flunked. And in fact, did you flunk so poorly, you're the worst group of students I've ever met. And he's even gone one step further to say, and the reason is because you don't know how to study, and it's because you're lazy, right? Let's turn the table just a tiny little bit. And if you look at the students in the room, what were the reactions on their face?
Shock.
Beyond shock, there was certainly that. Disbelief that the guy would actually ping on us. Disbelief, probably that we all did that badly. I don't know. The one that I actually like is there's sort of where the end where he's saying something. I forget what he's saying. The person looks around to his buddy like, do you think this guy's having any impact at all on these students at that point? Are they going to run out and study harder?
No.
Oh, he is having an impact. He's lowering their self-esteem,
That's-
especially the girls.
Well, I think probably the guys too. And I have had that
Doesn't
experience,
matter.
by the way. I will be the first to tell you. I had a great well-meaning professor one time who came to class and he said, and we'll see something similar later on, the reading today was on X. How many of you have read that reading? Has that ever happened to you guys?
Mhm.
And then you were terrified because you knew the next question was demonstrate for me what you learned in some way, form, or fashion. That instructor actually looked, and nobody, we were all like the one. Right? The impact was not so good. It was pretty obvious. Most of the students, a graduate level course, and I don't remember what learning, I think if I remember correctly now, learning. Yeah, a great place to have a learning lesson. And we're all going like this, afraid to raise our hands or even look up. So he finally says, okay, I need people that have actually read this material to raise your hand. And one or two people raised their hands, and he said, okay, the rest of you can leave. All right? This guy happened to be my major advisor, so my hand was up. I mean, luckily, he said, then he also gave us an out. He came back and he said, now, I'm sure some of you may not have studied the material very well, but I bet you've at least looked at it. One or two more people sheepishly raised their hands. He wound up telling the rest of the people they could stay, but we didn't make that mistake again, you can rest assured. Was it a good way to do that? I talked to him afterwards. I said, God, Dr. Marr, pardon me, Dr. So-and-so, why did you do that to us? He goes, because I knew none of you read it. I knew when you walked in the door, you weren't prepared. So, he had already made some sort of informal assessment, knowing what was going on in our bigger life probably, that the likelihood that we hadn't prepared was pretty high, and he was prepared to make that judgment. So anyway, what we wanted to do now, we've got the stage set, right? Not such a good way to do things. Some of you may have experienced it, I have. The first exercise that we wanted to do, right, is we were going to try to do some sort of small group things, and what we want to do is emphasize a couple of points. So there's not a bunch of us. We could almost, do we want to do this in 2 groups or just one larger group? One larger group? I think there's enough of us that we can get away with that. Okay, so first thing we want to do, what are the differences between assessment and evaluation? What's your thoughts? assessment, either formal or informal. Go ahead, Doc.
Look, the way that you are leading us, and I'm not, it's informal, and it's like, you get a global idea about what's going on without necessarily using any numerical or metric or something precise to measure whatever you are trying to assess. But to get a global idea, I would say more qualitative than quantitative.
Or maybe even quantitative, but perhaps in a more informal way to get to that data. Because there are informal measures that are qualitative. Okay, when we're trying to evaluate performance, what do we usually mean in most academic classes? Testing or some sort of demonstration of a particular skill. That's something we do in clinical settings an awful lot, right? You have to be able to do whatever it is you guys are learning to do. In our more basic classes, our more didactic classes, we have lectures and we have all kinds of exams, right? Theoretically, traditionally, in large classes, those tend to be large multiple choice kind of exams because that's the easiest way to score. We have all kinds of tools and rules on how to do good those. We'll talk about those later on too. And those are usually designed to provide a metric about how well this student is performing in comparison to the other students in the class.
Right.
So we can assign them the right grade. Right? That's evaluation at its best. Informal assessment a little bit different. What do you do? What did you really learn? Not just how well you're going to do on an exam. Ultimately, which you're the most interested in as an educator. Both?
Yeah, sure.
Both, clearly.
Can I jump into?
You certainly can.
One of the distinctions that is commonly made between assessment and evaluation can be related to what you actually do in a clinical setting. Okay, so in a clinical setting, let's say you're trying to get vital signs on the patient. You take all these measures, you're collecting the data, right? Blood pressure, pulse, all that stuff. Those are data. You're assessing that patient's health vital signs. The evaluation part, though, is making a value judgment about that. So the value judgment is, yeah, this blood pressure is within range, this, the pulse is right. So the distinction, evaluation depends on some sort of assessment, but the assessment is actually the collection of data that's related to the outcome that you're interested in. The evaluation is where then you apply the performance standards for students learning. So assessment can be formal or informal. A test is a method for assessing a student's performance. How you judge that performance is another step, though. So for instance, you may say, the student has to demonstrate a mastery at a 95% level. Well, that's your evaluation of the performance, and you say, that's adequate or that's not adequate. So it's that value judgment that really constitutes evaluation. And of course, the standards for the evaluation pertain to what does this student need to be able to do when they get out of this class or in this class. The assessment is just collecting the number, collecting the data, assigning numbers to the performance. You understand the distinction there? So a test is an assessment method. The value judgment you make about the student's performance on the test is the evaluation part. It's adequate, inadequate, something. Okay?
But the way that you're describing it, what you can put under the words, the meanings that you want, as long as they're globally within the same highway. And it seems to me, before coming to this class, I would say assessment and evaluation interchangeably. The meaning that you gave them now leaves me with some difficulties, truly, because I have, in my classes, I would see two students who have achieved the same score at the standardized test. And when we don't have any other methods to evaluate their performance,
To assess the performance.
yeah.
Towards the criteria.
So it would become difficult for me to say, for us, this is it. This is the assessment and the evaluation. many students are graduating based on passing the score. And rarely do we now go and assess their ability to use their information, whether they know it and they're able to process it and whatever, which if I understood well, if the knowledge that they acquire, the raw knowledge, is here used efficiently in a way that would qualify them to be the doctors that we want them to be, or whatever, engineers or whatever. Am I understanding you well here, or?
Let me say a couple things. One is, you're right, very often assessment and evaluation are used almost interchangeably. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of value in making really keen distinctions between the two terms. However, I do think there's a lot of value in saying, we're collecting information about your performance. And now I'm going to make a value judgment about your performance. So, it may be in some classes that a 90%, you got a 90% on this exam, that really might not be adequate. I can think of some practical exams in many of our professions where if you make a critical error, regardless of your score on the test, you make a critical error, you fail the entire test. So it's the value judgment that we assign to that observation. And assessment is a way to observe a student's traits or behaviors.
Okay.
The evaluation is making a value judgment about it. And now, evaluation value. That's the way I remember the distinction there.
So let me ask you this then. What are some ways that you assess students in your settings? Tests, we've said tests. I don't know everybody's setting.
Critiques, like have students read an article and do a critique on it, and this is assessing, but of course you're going to assign a value to it in the end. So
Okay.
discussion boards, in case of online courses, have an assignment, they have to read something or watch something and give their opinion on something, and you're assessing, but you're going to give a value to it in the end too.
Okay. Laura?
In my graduate classes, I sometimes would have a discussion, whole class, not a large class, 10 students, and then have the students write something that was not graded or anything, but that would help me understand where their thinking was in relation to whatever the topic had been. So,
Okay, so you had a behavioral task that you could then go back and read, sort of a after-the-fact version.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
others?
Presentations.
Yeah, your students stand up and you score them on.
But this is a more of a lab setting, so we
Okay.
present to each other and see. This is a way to just show the amount of work we've done.
Mhm.
So there's no evaluation to it, there's no score to it, but it's just.
But it's a way to certainly assess if you're making progress. Okay, well, if I say progress, I put a value judgment on it, didn't I? But anyway, we're trying to stay away from that, right?
It's I understand all that we're talking about, but it's sounding like to me that it's this evaluation is value. It's kind of like subjective a little bit. And how can you make subjective judgments, because then the student, I don't know, you're going to complain. Well, why we performed in the assessment, we got the same values, but then we're assessing, whatever, but then she's doing better than I am in terms of value, whatever.
Well, that's not the way we usually set standards for performance, though. Usually we say, like if you have, say for instance, you're evaluating the students, they're practicing medical procedures of some kind, and you're watching them in a practical examination. They have to perform all of these steps in that procedure. And if you define that process correctly to match what they need to be able to do in the clinic, then that assessment will actually match the real world performance. So it's not subjective at all. It's, we lay out the scoring rubric, we lay out the standards for that. I mean, we could actually assess and evaluate these student presentations by having a scoring rubric that said, you've got to include this in your introduction, and you've got to include this in the statement of the problem. very much like you do on your essays. I know you do. When the students write up a summary of the research articles they've written, you're looking for certain things in there, so it's not subjective in that sense, because you've already defined ahead of time what the students will be doing.
But going back to the example that you talked about, for example, you have these students, and you know, because you've been dealing with them in a small class, even in the clinical setting or in the classroom, you know how much they know. And they make that critical error where their evaluation is going to be really low, but you know they know. So couldn't that become subjective if you try to help that student give a second chance, or like, you know, because that's going to depend on their judgment, because there's nothing.
Well, the kind of critical error I'm talking about is like in, say, in the dental hygiene clinic, and, you know, we're testing a student's ability to scale teeth, whatever. If they do all of the steps in the process right, they get all of that calculus off and all of that, but they don't use sterile technique, doesn't matter how well they scale the teeth, they fail that exam. That's the kind of critical error that I'm talking about. So no, we wouldn't let them slide. We'd say, how you fail that exam, you have to demonstrate again that.
But the way I look at it here, I understand your point. The way I look at it is you are given more points to something that is so critical compared to the other things, and that should be announced to the students. They should know.
The students should know what they're being.
Exactly what is said. So I do that sometimes. I tell them, I give questions to my students. I tell them, this question would count for 5 points and the other one. So if you miss really big. And you might tell them, if you miss this one, you miss the whole thing again. But is it, now we're not going back here, we shifted from the value judgment here to the...
Well, the value judgment in,
Yeah, you're on the right track.
yeah, the value judgment from my perspective, I'm guessing I'm on the right track. The value judgment from my perspective is you determine the relative value of those points.
Correct.
Based upon the value of the criticality of whatever it is they were supposed to know or demonstrate.
Correct.
That's
But
the value part.
when you
A skilled clinician has to be able to do blah, 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 right?
This is more important than.
And this is more important than that. Okay, so I'm a psychologist. I used to do a lot of social skills training. And there's a little fuzzier, okay? It's a little fuzzier because what you do to demonstrate competence may be somewhat, not as easily defined. And we used to have to teach people to problem solve. That was one of the models we were working under. Did a lot of research on that. And it was always interesting. We would say, you pick an alternative and something happens, right? When that situation happens, you have to be able to demonstrate sizing up what happened, what your goal is in that situation, what barriers there were to prevent you from getting your goal. You had to decide on a course of behavior, whatever you were going to do, and then you had to implement that course of behavior. Sometimes you decided a behavior based upon the relative consequences. That was the rule that we taught. First and foremost, it gets my goal. You don't want to teach people when you're teaching them how to be more skilled if they're not going to do stuff that leads to the goal they want to have, right? That doesn't make any sense. Secondly, there are some things you can do that might get your goal, but have what I like to call a killer consequence. They're so morally reprehensible or dastardly or whatever word you want to put on that that's bad. You shouldn't use that alternative. You know, I can go, if my goal is to get a Coke, I can go to the machine outside, buy a Coke, or I can go to the person I see walking across and pull a gun, right, and say, I want your Coke, right? I probably wouldn't teach a person to utilize that response, even though because it has that killer consequence. Things with killer consequences usually wind up being stuff that you make the value judgment on from an evaluation standpoint to say, no, you wouldn't do that.
And the point that you make is really
very
good
good.
too, because, you know, as we're putting together our assessment methods, especially those formal assessment methods, we need to build into those assessment methods those values exactly like you're talking about, so that the assessment method accurately reflects the value judgment that you want to make down the road. You're exactly on track.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's transition a little bit and talk a little bit more about informal and formal assessment. Dr. Murphy, I think you were going to say that.
Sure. Okay, so I think, you know, we've talked about sort of very informally anyway, the differences between informal and formal assessment. And I think all of you come to this with a lot of knowledge, either as educators or as students. And you've made these observations over the course of your life, the course of your career. Basically, informal and formal assessment methods. Now again, this is making observations of what students are doing, because we're collecting all this information about their performance and how well they're meeting the objectives, how well they're mastering the competencies. Basically, informal and formal assessment methods differ on these factors up here. And we've already talked about methods some. So, for instance, obviously a multiple choice exam, that's a very formal method of doing an observation of a student's knowledge. We have a practical exam for medical procedures. That's a very formalized way of making an observation of what the student can do and what the students know. So what I'd like to do is talk about, but before we get to the methods, I want to talk about the purposes though, and pick your brains about that. So what would be, in your mind, as you observe, what are the basic purposes for using formal assessments with learners? It doesn't matter what the setting is. What are the purposes of using formal assessments? What do you want to accomplish with that?
Well, know their level of knowledge.
Okay.
On the subject matter.
Want to know if their level of knowledge is adequate to meet
To what
your
is that?
stated objectives? Okay, good.
You want to give them a stomach ache? Oh, no, sorry.
All right.
Sometimes.
The way I look at it personally, I feel responsibility towards society, and because you're releasing people and putting in their hands other people's lives, and you want to make sure that really they know, at least we would say, certain level of knowledge, basic knowledge, in addition to the tools to think about other problems that they might encounter and they have not known. So these two components are extremely important when we're talking about doctors, and for that matter, probably in any profession.
Everybody else, yeah.
So you need to have, you want them to have the basics as well as the ability to think about novel situations that might emerge in their future. So therefore, when I say I certify somebody, I am telling the community, society, that this person is trustworthy. You can, and they can, you can trust them and they can provide you with the services or whatever it is we claim they can do.
Absolutely. And the word you use there is key. We're certifying that this person is competent. And
Right.
that's one of the purposes. I mean, if you think about licensing board exams, that's a very formal assessment, and they are declaring that you have the knowledge and skill necessary to enter that profession. So, okay, what are some other purposes for formal assessment? As we're thinking about these methods, think about when in the learning process this assessment occurs too.
Well, to
purposes.
assign grades,
Hmm?
to assign grades.
And why do we want to assign grades?
Why?
Mhm.
Because that's how it's been done for millennia.
No, there's really good reasons for assigning grades.
Well, I mean, we are trying to distinguish levels of competence or levels of knowledge, I suppose.
So one of the reasons we do it is we try to rank students in, these are very competent students, these are less competent students, and these people are scaled out somewhere in between. We don't want to know who's the most competent, who's the least competent. So, and that's important. We also, go ahead.
I was just, and tied to that very line, we also the purpose of assessing progress towards a higher level of competence. So if you have people scaled in some way, then what does that tell you in terms of what you need to do to assist those people to get to that certified level that you want them to get to? So it helps me determine what intervention, remediation, extra opportunities to learn a student needs or a person needs to perform in that profession.
Other purposes.
Not to the point exactly, but boy, this really brings something to mind. And it is that for many years in my career, this whole idea of remediation and using these data to help the students and identify those and help them in the very way that they needed, really, a lot of us don't do that. And I'm saying that mostly about myself, because until our accrediting agency said, you know what? If this student doesn't pass this or makes this kind of score, then your program needs to demonstrate to us that you are remediating that student in the appropriate way. And it was eye-opening to me
Yeah.
when we had to start doing that. But it's,
So, another purpose is to determine opportunities for remediation and ultimately gaining competence. Other purposes for formal assessment.
If I may say, it's probably an assessment of our teaching in a way. Because after all, if we are teaching and whatever, we think that we're the best teachers in the world and our students, that I truly think that, and I don't believe that the students are always right, but in any way, that's not my philosophy, but I think students are all intelligent, that's what I think. And when we teach them,
They're all capable.
yeah, they're capable, and
We wouldn't admit
when we
that.
We
teach
wouldn't
them,
admit it if they weren't somewhat capable,
And
right?
we-
Or at least we
they
would try to
think-
screen them out.
Right.
We might not always get it
Right,
right,
right.
but we usually get it close to right.
right. So in that sense, really, it's an evaluation of our teaching.
You know, it's really interesting, if you look at what's going on nationally with all the controversy right now with No Child Left Behind and all the testing, you know, hundreds of tests over the course of a student's education career in elementary through high school. Originally, those tests were set up to do exactly what we're talking about, which is to evaluate a student's knowledge and skills at every point in their educational career. At some point, the purposes for those tests were sort of taken over by politicians. And then they started using them to evaluate not only teachers, but schools. The tests were not developed for that purpose. So it was kind of like it was a distortion of purposes that they're not supposed to use.
Off-label use.
Yeah, it was off-label use, that's exactly right. In our own classrooms, I would do this all the time. You know, I give a statistics test. If, 75% of the students didn't get that item that they should have, if they didn't get it correct, that they should have gotten correct, I take that as an indictment of, I didn't teach this adequately. I didn't provide the right experiences for those students to master that objective. So I'd go back and reteach it, or find another way to test it. But you're right. That's one of the uses that we make a formal assessment. Other purposes that you can think of? One of the things that we do is we also determine whether students are capable of moving on in the curriculum. So, first-year medical students, the faculty look at those students at the end of the year, they decide whether this student can progress to second year. They take level one, exam when in their junior year, I think.
after their freshman year, isn't it?
Level one.
The step one?
Step one.
Step one is the end of the second.
In the second year, yeah, before they go to the junior year. A formal assessment to determine whether they can progress on and on and on. So we use these as gauges about whether people are capable of moving out through the educational program. So let's contrast that with informal. What are the purposes of informal assessment? There's probably some overlap, but there's some real clear differences.
I look at it like coaching, your day-to-day stuff. And, you got the ball and you're gonna score and you made the wrong moves. I tell you, you could have played with your body in a different way and avoid that guy who stopped you and blah, blah, blah. And that is not about the game, the final results of the score of the game. It's about even them assessing their day-to-day moves and giving them kind of some advice about how to optimize their learning here, finding learning, or their move, their playground or something like that.
Very good. And you don't need a formal assessment for that.
Right.
It would be wasting time and effort. And besides, it would be overkill, yeah. What are the other
I
purposes?
don't think the informal assessment could allow you to see where the students are and then you can try to prepare them to succeed in the formal assessment.
Exactly. So it's sort of like preliminary steps toward that ultimate performance.
So it's more like a feedback to you, so you can help coach and teach them what they need, equip them with whatever they need to
Yeah.
succeed in that final step.
Both of you have been talking about really key distinctions about informal assessment. One is that you're giving the student feedback about their performance to help them improve. You're talking about you as a teacher are using that information so that you can adjust your own teaching performance to help facilitate learning for that student. So it's a very different purpose from formal assessment. And a lot of people don't use it. They know to do it, but they don't use it deliberately a lot of times because they're so focused on that formal assessment at the end of the course, at the end of the module, at the end of the lesson, whatever that is. You know. What else do I have here? One of the things we do with informal assessment too is we diagnose learning deficiencies. This is what you were talking about. We actually use it to diagnose where in this process are you going wrong. So we got a medical procedure, you're watching the student, and at the point where you're coaching them along, I love that word, that coaching. You're coaching them along, they're doing this step right, and all of a sudden they make a mistake in the procedure. Give them feedback right then. I see what's going wrong. Try it this way. Let's do this over, and then you can correct that procedure. So it's guidance all along the way, but you're diagnosing where the problem with the learning is. This is also really, like Laura was talking about remediation. In fact, I was just talking with one of our assistant deans today about how difficult it is for faculty to make that move from being the evaluator to the educator. And the educator is a person who diagnoses deficiencies. They figure out where the student is weak conceptually, what they're not putting together, and then we put together a remediation so that they can put all of those pieces together. Diagnosing deficiencies is a really important part of informal assessment. It's not so much with formal assessment. It's hard after the fact to diagnose a problem. Because that student's gone now. You can't diagnose it after they're gone. Talk about, based on what we've talked about already, it's clear. Formal assessments because you're making high stakes decisions about students. Can they go into the profession? Can they progress? Can they move on to the next year? Those are high stakes decisions, so we have to have really well designed assessments to make sure that we're making the right decision. So we're looking for assessments that have high reliability, are very reliable, that they're valid. At some point I think we're going to talk about validity in one of the other sessions. Writing good assessments for formal assessment is really, really difficult. How about with informal assessments? It's sort of on the spot. It's based on that one student's performance. And, you may have a checklist in your head about what that student should be doing, but it's geared for each student or each small group of students that you're working with. It doesn't take a long time to put it together. Most of the time, it doesn't take almost, seconds to a few minutes to do it on the spot, but it's a very, very different kind of a process. Good educators are skilled at both of those. Good educators are skilled at creating and administering formal assessments, but they're also good at that informal process of watching students, listening to students, getting them feedback, getting that feedback. It's the whole repertoire is what good educators need to know how to do. Really experienced educators do it naturally without even having to think about it, But they only get that way because they practice that for years and years and years. Impact on learning and teaching. How about the impact of formal assessment on learning? How would you gauge that? How would you describe that? How much impact does formal assessment have on learning?
It's variable, I can tell you. From personal experience, myself having taken, as you said, millions of tests, in the past, and from the fellows I train and the residents, they are variable. There are people who really, that's the statement about teaching to the test works for some people, doesn't work for others. And I have noted that I have fellows that I tell them, let's study for the engineering exam. We have one formal engineering exam every year. And some of them, they're way smarter after the exam because they have prepared, they engaged all the energy that they had, and they knew that I was watching them. And others, the same, did not make any difference, although they probably tried. So I think people have the impact of on learning process, the expectation, the energy, spent and used in order to take the test and pass it and what have you, can be a learning opportunity. That's how I look at it. I tell them, you're not studying to the test in order to really beat anybody, but to learn the material. That is an opportunity, and you can check. In our engineering exam, they get a list of all the topics where they have failed. And that would give them this feedback to improve. Yeah. So I kind of use it, before and after.
Right. Formal assessments, sort of the looming formal assessment, can motivate some students to, like you said, some students can be motivated to really buckle down and learn the material, learn the skill. It can be used to motivate learning, but after the fact, if you've done the formal assessment, you've got the results back, it's too late.
Correct.
To really have any impact on learning, because that's done. They'll move on to the next thing. Informal assessment is very different because you're actually using that to facilitate learning. You're observing the student, you're watching them, you are listening to them, and you're giving them feedback in real time. So the purpose of informal assessment strictly is to facilitate learning for the student and to also improve your own teaching.
If I may make one comment,
Sure.
From my experience, I have noticed that building this knowledge base for preparing for formal exams works very well. It doesn't work. Do you know how to use it? It doesn't work. You need to coach them and go to the informal process.
Exactly, very good.
And that is really something perhaps we need both. It's not
Absolutely.
perhaps, certainly we need both.
Yeah.
You know.
That's key. Like I said, good educators do both of these things really well. And you have to they have to both be in your repertoire, regardless of how you teach, the setting in which you teach, in order to really facilitate learning and then certify learning at the end of the course of it. And the last group, the summative and formative evaluation, is really similar to what we've been talking about. Summative evaluation is after the fact, okay? The student is expected to learn something. We're going to give an exam. We're going to sum up their performance. That summative evaluation, you passed it, you're good to go. Formative evaluation is information that you're using. You're making judgments about the student's performance, and you are using that to form their learning. So informal assessment has a key role in formative evaluation. Formal assessment has a key role in summative evaluation. It's just important to keep those distinctions. Now, there are times in summative evaluation, and I bet you have used this or you've been subjected to it, where a faculty member would have given an exam, they've certified, they've given you, they've graded you, you know whether you've mastered the objectives or not. But then the faculty member will also use that information for formative purposes. They will either adjust their teaching in the future, they will counsel you on, like when we set up a remediation plan, using summative evaluation methods, the data in a summative evaluation process for forming learning on an ongoing basis. So a remediation plan is a good example of using formative evaluation. Okay? Just some differences between those two. So,
Terms you hear all the time, right?
Yep. Okay, Dr. Boone.
Yeah, so, and well, we'll do this quickly because we've already said a lot of this. This is just a grocery list of some of the assessment strategies or techniques that people use for informal evaluation. And some of them actually can be made formal as well. Because remember, what's the distinction there for your purpose? Okay? So, we use questioning. How many of you ask students questions in the lab? All the time. Golly, if you did this, what might happen? If this client presents with this, God, my psychology background's coming out, I never say that word. If this consumer or this client or this patient comes out with this particular set of whatever, what kind of things might happen? So you're using a questioning process. And we see instructors, good instructors, ask questions to class, right? Depending on the class, some classes are more talkative than others, depending on the context of the class. It doesn't always work. We also see in really huge, and others it works really beautifully. We also see in huge, large lecture halls, formal ways to do that. And you can do it in here actually, but we have it set up, in many of our lecture halls to use the clicker technologies where you could use that to engage students' immediate understanding of a concept that you've just talked to them about. And boy, I've seen people that are really, really good at that. We have faculty here that work really hard at that. They have a whole litany of objectives and questions that tie to those objectives. And as they're walking through their lecture material, they'll say to that 175 or 110 or 50 or whatever, how many students are actually there that day, they'll say, golly, if blah, 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 and this question pops up, tell me how you vote. What's the right answer? And the sizable percentage of the students get it correct. What do they assume?
That works really well, and you can remedy this stuff too. What's going on, because now I'm teaching online, but I had experience with lecture, like teaching 150 students and not having the clicker, but I engage a lot by questioning, and that's the first thing I do when I get in class, and I revisit what I talked about before I started, and I said, so who can tell me about it? And then you have that quiet class, and then I start, I can't believe it. It's like 1 point in the overall grade, and then you start getting them, So if they really know it, somebody is going to start, one is going to complete, and all that. But if they don't know at all, you need to go back.
And then you use that to go back and assess what you
before you get to the
students.
next step. And even in the middle of the lecture, as you were teaching them, and you just construct a scenario, interacting everything, and you're trying to get them to tell you that answer that should be obvious by now, and you're having difficulty with it. So you have to go back and kind of, in the middle of the lecture, revisit everything. So that, I think, questioning, it's really good way to assess.
And it doesn't have to be used, you don't have to use technology to get
No,
there.
and
The
even
old-fashioned way of doing that is to say, so, how many of you believe blah, blah, blah?
Yeah.
And if they're saying the right answer, that's no different than doing the actual percentage of students that did that using a clicker, right? Yeah, it's nice if you want to go back and assess those trends and things. There's other values that data could give you, but in essence, you can do questions like that. It could be open-ended, it could be closed, restricted, focused kind of question. We'll talk about some of that a little bit later on, right? Formal test items, but a little bit different discussion. But you can all kinds of questions.
Actually, one of the things that Rafael said in there, I think is really important. Probably the most widely used informal assessment technique is exactly that. Just ask questions.
Ask questions.
Get the feedback, give feedback, and it's really, really useful. You can formalize that to some extent, like if you make a big lecture hall, you've got 50, 175 students, have them pair up, they discuss it, they come up with answers, they compare their answers with the model answer. It's easy to do, but people tend to not do it if they don't put it in their lecture notes. So it's really good in your lecture notes to say, okay, I'm going to ask this question right now. I'm going to have the students do this right now. And then you make sure that you build it in.
And that's also one of those things that makes the technology mediated version of that really good, because you can prep all that stuff and click, boom, do it. All right. So, okay, second technique up there, observing. If you're doing any kind of behavioral competencies, obviously one way to look at that is just to watch, right? See if they're doing it, or to use the artifacts of what they're supposed to be doing to test if they get it right. You talked about sterile procedure earlier in the dental clinic. We do sterile procedure upstairs in the sterile room for the pharmacology students in pharmacy. And you know, they have they go down sterile procedure, they actually do something, and then they walk out of the room, and they're supposed to learn to scrub, for example, and then they get the growing culture of their students to see if in fact they did that well. Okay, so you use an artifact. That's basically how the observational strategy works. There are formal observational strategies down there on the bottom of the page. It's something that people do episodically. You can use a sampling approach to that. I used to look at little kids a lot. I did a lot of work in nursery schools at one point in my career. And you know, one of the things that makes teachers really, really happy is what? Kids are nice and quiet. They love that, right? So the disruptive kids, like me, they're the ones that are always in trouble. And so one of the things you have to do when you consult with teachers like that, every now and then as a psychologist, you get called in particularly problematic kids and help them come up with a way to help remediate that behavior. So you would, one of the tricks that you would use is you would teach them to sample that student's behavior, because in fact what happened is they did that systematically, they weren't down all the time, right? And that gave you a baseline that you could then build on. So you can use event sampling for a specific time, you count the number of things they do, the number of times Stephen throws paper wads at the class or whatever. That's an event sample approach, right? Or you could do a time sample approach. I used to love to teach teachers to take a simple little tape recorder back then, and on you could do it on your cell phone now, and you know, it'll say every 15 seconds it goes beep, and you look at that kid to see what they're doing the behavior or not. Okay, so there's all kinds of observational strategies, some more formal than others that work very, very well in classrooms. Laura already brought up the idea of records, I think. You look back, or actually that was you. You look back at what they did, have them come back with some sort of reaction and show you how they actually did it after whatever given it was, the learning. You can keep a running record of performance, that also works. There are thousands, you make a rating scale up. I mean, rating scales from a formal standpoint have a very clear set of properties and all those kinds of things. From an informal assessment standpoint, it's like a checklist. Does it work? And many people do best when they live their life around checklists. Right? Any of you that way? I have friends that will say, you know, if I don't have a checklist about what I'm going to do today, it's not going to get done. I personally don't do that because I don't deal with those things well, but my spouse is a checklist kind of person. You know, her day is planned out, and boy, she checks them off, and she feels really good when she accomplishes a list of the checks. It's a good way to assess is she accomplishing whatever, which you apply a learning standpoint. The checklist does the same thing. Am I learning or doing the behaviors I need to do? Work samples, go actually observe people in their real setting. You probably do that in the lab, right? You look at people's procedures in the labs. We used to in the clinical labs pretty regularly do that kind of thing. Portfolios, I think you're going to have a whole class on portfolio. Is that correct, Laura, down the road? Portfolios and documenting?
Not in this series.
Not in this series. Okay,
Right.
well, the idea there is keep a record of your work.
Right.
A simple version of a portfolio, a record of how you work, what you've learned, how you learned it, so on and so forth.
I did one on developing an educator's portfolio in August. Maybe that's what you're
That's what I'm thinking of. Okay, Mark. I knew we did that recently.
Yes.
You can actually sit down and do a more structured, formal version, an interview of what have you learned, so to speak. So those are just some examples. And these are all really common sense, if you think about it. Those are all strategies that you can use. Now, what makes for good informal assessment? Picking strategies, multiple strategies, and tying them to then strategies that fit the objectives of what you're trying to learn. Okay, so some strategies work better for some things than others. And there's all kinds of literature on all those techniques if you want to learn more about that. There's tons of that out there.
For those of you who have been teaching a while or have just started, I mean, Rafael was talking about using some informal techniques, questioning. How did you do it with a big group, a big lecture hall of 150 students?
It actually worked because I think it depends on the instructor how you come in your classroom too. Because for some instructors, they can't do it. In the classroom, people are talking and doing stuff. But I don't know. I think the students were, first of all, I had great attendance because I rewarded them for attendance. 2 points on the overall grade if they had less than 3 unexcused absences throughout the semester. So I rarely had
Anybody miss?
people miss. And I had them sign and put their social number in their LS4 so they know about it. So I had great attendance, and I taught biochemistry, which is our material, so they always wanted to be there. So, and I talk a lot. Something that I always got 5, like math, mastery of the subject matter. Like, cause it's just like I have the PowerPoints of bullet guide there, and I like them to take notes because then we're engaging them with all their senses and they're having to complete their notes. And as I'm doing that, I'm asking questions. And their attention is, I get their attention because they have to write those notes. So they are asking like, oh, can you repeat that? Can you? So they are actively like engaging in the lecture. And I'm always asking questions. Like every 5 minutes of lecture, I'm throwing a question out there, engaging them, and I get great response out of the students. And when it's something that I really want them to get, and I throw their 1 point on your grade, then you have all the hands going crazy, one completing the thought of the other, so it really works.
And actually, the point that you make there is one of the real advantages of informal assessment techniques, if they're used well, they create a much more interactive learning environment. You get the students engaged, faculty members getting feedback from the students getting feedback about what they're learning. It becomes a much more active learning environment because of the use of these informal techniques. Pretty soon they just become natural parts of that whole partnership and learning that happens, occurs between a professor and a class of students. In a lab, it's a little bit different. How kinds of informal assessment techniques have you guys seen, you know, as you're working with individuals or small groups of students? Or what have your professors done with you?
It's just asking questions, discussing those, why, and then brainstorming as to why things could be this way, like how you write this discussion for the paper.
Because they're trying to encourage you to think critically.
Yes.
So they're going to say, why is that? What's your reasoning behind that?
And then we start thinking about different ways things would work, or why this is the reasons for what we see.
Yeah.
Could it be technical, it could be biological, could it be repeated? Then you start thinking about, okay, it could be this. Then you have a lot of other things that come into play.
So in that process, the faculty members learning about how critically can this student think? Where are the gaps in their critical thinking? How do I need to have to coach them along to think even more critically? Anything else that you want to add?
Well, I mean, that's really what it comes down to is, especially in a laboratory setting where it is hands-on, where they have to take what they know and really apply it. It's not just simply book memorization anymore. That being able to not only become a critical thinker, but independent. At a certain level, you can't always go to your boss with every piece of data and say, what do you think? What am I supposed to do next? I want them, because when I have my own students one day, to be able to not have to be having phone in their hand.
Yeah.
I want them to be able to anticipate what I would say. And beyond anticipation is to be able to go beyond me, because I don't know everything, and my students need to be able to be thinking more, because we think more than our predecessors, oftentimes because it just won't last.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of done that,
I think we can skip this because we've talked about this.
I think we've talked about a lot of that, so yeah, we're jumping ahead then.
Yeah, let's go
So, feedback, okay, here's another question that we sort of wanted to talk about a little bit. A lot of usefulness out of informal assessment is that it gives you the tools that you need to provide students feedback about their learning, all right? So what are some of the characteristics of effective feedback? Does that make sense? These are things that we know from the research literature, and there's tons and tons of literature on learning and the role of feedback in learning. That's probably one of the most well-researched areas within learning. What makes for good feedback? Okay, it's got to be timely. You know, somebody does something right or they do something wrong. Doesn't matter. If I don't comment on it in a relatively temporally contiguous time, timely way, my feedback is not going to be nearly as effective. That's especially true if people are doing things that they need corrected feedback on, that they can do a different way. And you can watch that with little kids, you can watch that with adults. I mean, it really doesn't have a whole lot of impact on me most of the time, if my spouse says, Steve, you did blah, 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 and that was something that happened several months ago, and it really bothered me for the last several months. I mean, I go, really? Yeah. I'm probably not that smart, I probably don't even remember it happened.
And that explains also why formal assessments are not really good for facilitated learning. Because you have a student who's in this course all semester long, they take the final exam. Even if you give them feedback about that final exam, it's not in a timely manner, it's after the fact, so it's not.
Way after the fact.
Informal assessment though, it can be timely, it can be right on the spot, it can happen when the learning is occurring.
Good feedback is informative, very clearly describes what was good, bad, or indifferent. All right, it gives you something that you can hang your hat on about how ways to do that again, something I should do again, something I should do different.
One of the errors I see faculty do very often, they're really good about correcting deficiencies. You did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong.
And they're really bad.
But they're bad about telling the student what they did right. A lot of times students will do something right and it's just kind of by accident and they really don't know what they did right. You know? And so we need to say, yeah, you really, you did that history and physical really, really well. And this is what you did when you were doing in the history and physical. So tell them exactly what they did right, too.
And that's something that's really easier to do with a smaller class. Because
Yes,
with,
without a doubt.
now I'm teaching, I have 2 students in one class and 8 in the other, and it's online, but I can be on top of it. I can be giving this feedback and be really specific about what it is and spend time like saying, well, you were going in the right direction, however, that's what the instructions said, and I would like for you to do this, this, and this, and I'm giving them opportunities, which before, I'm really traditional, so I was really against it, it's one chance and that's it, but I'm seeing like now, like I'm treating them, it's grad students, and because I have a research background, and you have to improve them, so I'm not just looking for them to have that knowledge in the subject matter that I'm teaching, but I'm trying to improve them in their technical writing skills, which is not the purpose of that particular class, but it's important for them, and I believe in that. So I'm giving them chances to revise their assignments, not the exam itself, but the assignments that they have. I'm giving them chances, and I'm giving this timely and informative and specific feedback, which is have to practice.
Yeah, it takes some practice can do it, but you can get very, very skilled at it. And I've had the luxury of working with people that there's some people would say you should probably say 3 or 4 good things before you say 1 bad thing. We tend to not do that. Back to your point, we tend to go the other way. The other thing that I remember from my behavioral training days is we used to say practice makes perfect. Right? That's a saying you probably heard sometime in your life. It's really not true. Practice makes what you practice.
If you're doing
So
it wrong.
if you do it wrong, you get
You do it
really good at
perfectly
doing it
wrong.
really, really wrong, right? So you have to have feedback to help you get to what's the right way. Not evaluative. By that I mean the tone of how you provide that feedback. We're not saying like that person, the first thing, y'all are the stupidest class I've ever seen in my life. And if you don't start studying, you're going to never get out of this class, and you'll have the pleasure of seeing me again next semester.
Another example of that is this, though. In the university where I used to live, we had a dental hygiene program, and students had to do, they had to work in the clinic every day, and they got graded on their performance in the clinic with every patient. So at the end of the day, they got a daily grade. They were evaluated. They got the grade. It was a formative, it was a summative assessment for that day. The students had a really tough time learning because they were so worried about that grade, it created all sorts of stress for them. What needed to happen, and so what the faculty ended up doing was, we're going to dispense with daily grades. What we're going to do is create a rating form that is designed to give the student feedback that's informative, specific, and non-evaluative. When they started doing that, student performance really increased because they were not working for a grade, they were learning to do the skill. So non-evaluative part is really important for good feedback.
And if this is off topic, just say it is and don't worry about it. But when you develop a rating scale, well, because I've had this question in the past, do people typically do a I'm sorry, I'm having trouble, an absolute rating scale that is based on, the highest value is based on what an independent practitioner should be able to do, so that a student may get a 2, but they're, a junior and you're a sophomore in your program, and so that's okay? Or do people develop scales for someone at that level of their program?
That depends on the purposes for the evaluation.
Okay. I mean, one's not
One's
seen
not
as
inherently
better
better
than
than the other.
other.
Many
Okay.
times it's very difficult to say what a person at a developmental stage should be able to demonstrate. So
Right.
sometimes it's easier to say a person in professionals do these things.
Okay.
But it just
It doesn't
depends.
matter.
It really
Okay.
A good example is this. You're teaching research, PhD students to do research. At some point along the way, they have to write good literature reviews, or they have to write abstracts first, and then they have to start putting it together. And so you're going to grade them on their appropriate developmental stage. At the end of the program, they've got to write a full-blown dissertation that's publishable and all of that other stuff. So the scale can change depending on the developmental needs of the student, of the learner.
Okay, focused on learners' behavior, I think that's pretty straightforward. Focused on the intended learning outcome. That's actually sort of related to what we we're just saying, but the idea is, what is it we're trying to document, okay? Characteristics of good feedback. And you can do good feedback in large groups or small groups. It's definitely easier in small groups. But I've seen people that could provide group-based feedback in a room of 300 folks and do it perfectly where you thought they were talking to you. And the key is that they're talking to you. Another trick on feedback that I used to like to tell people a lot, if you work in small groups, sometimes you observe behavior or whatever that's just not very good. I mean, they're just not getting it, whatever that is. They're not demonstrating those competencies. And it's difficult to decide how far to go in pointing out what's not so good, right? Because it all is bad, right? So you've got to take in account sort of this notion that Laura's asking, where is this person developmentally? What would be the right incremental step? Because we're not going to attend to a discourse about how horrible you did everything you were just supposed to do. That's just going to irritate me. But if I can pick what you did was, okay, one piece in particular that would improve what you just said is this: provide feedback on that and then build the next time, and the next time, and the next time. So you're providing incremental feedback to get to that final goal. Another trick about small groups that I always found very helpful is sometimes if something is particularly difficult to assess how bad or good they even were, you're not the only person in the group. I think there's a very realistic helper pool setting here. So like when I used to was just at a loss about where to start, one of the things I used to use as a trick to getting good feedback was to say, golly, okay, hey, Dr. Murphy, what do you think about what you just saw? Or Laura, what do you think about what you just saw? What was something good about that? So you structure towards something positive. You're just like, well, God, where do I start? It's all horrible. All right? And you use that to get you in the ballpark of giving feedback. And I found many times, I did a lot of clinical therapy kind of group things. I found many times the feedback that the members of the group gave was far better than the feedback that I individually could provide that person, because you're opening up that experience space, and we all kind of look at people a little bit differently, and that's very helpful.
It's also a good method for seeing if those other students can apply the same standards.
And then if you're really tricky and smart, the second half is just that. You say if they can provide that feedback, that means they understand the behavior that you're trying to accomplish too. And that's something that we used to teach people to use as a specific technique to help you, do assessment of your students informally as a group and provide remediation feedback to people specifically. And it seemed to work really, really well.
It's really good when you're teaching medical procedures or
Yep.
lab procedures, and pair students up. One student will, like medical procedures especially, we got students who are working on each other. One student's doing the procedure, the other student's recipient, and then you have a third student who's observing it and giving feedback about that. Of course, you have to teach them what the standards for the performance is, but in the process, they're also internalizing those standards. Switch them out a lot of times. It's a really good technique for getting a lot of learning done quickly.
With larger groups, yeah, because it takes the onus off of you as the only person that can fit any one of those roles. All right, good stuff. What informal assessment is not? I'm not sure how far to go with this right now because of time, but we've said a lot of things. We can show you some examples, now video again. Many times people say that I'm trying to encourage and I'm using questioning. They use the Socratic method. Y'all, that was an old school kind of technique that we use to question people to assess their learning. Here's a good example of that. I don't know if this is maybe in the dark ages again. Some of you may remember this TV program called, what was it called?
Paper Chase.
Paper Chase.
Mr. Hart, will you recite the facts of Hawkins versus McGee? I do have your name right. You are Mr. Hart.
Yes, my name is Hart.
You're not speaking loud enough, Mr. Hart. You speak up.
Yes, my name is Hart.
Mr. Hart, you're still not speaking loud enough. Will you stand? Now that you're on your feet, Mr. Hart, maybe the class will be able to understand you. You are on your feet.
Yes, I'm on my feet.
Loudly, Mr. Hart. Fill this room with your intelligence. Now, will you give us the facts of the case?
I haven't read the case.
Class assignments for the first day are posted on the bulletin boards in Langdale and Austin halls. You must have known that.
No.
You assumed that this first class would be a lecture, an introduction to the course.
Yes, sir.
Never assume anything in my classroom. Mr. Hart, I will myself give you the fact.
Okay, you get the drift. He's asking questions. Is he asking useful questions? Maybe, maybe not. What happens if you do it that way? I'm going to run it ahead. Let's see if we can make it play right about there.
Mr. Pruitt.
That's just a screamer, man.
Okay, so we're going to assume that the questioning that he was using wasn't very effective for that guy. All it did was make him sick to his stomach. Yeah.
Well, the previous slide, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by pimping.
Oh, in medical schools, there's this whole tradition, especially in clinical.
And law
settings.
schools too.
Okay.
Medical schools and law schools. I'm hoping it's dying out because it doesn't work, but it's this rapid fire, picking on you and asking you a question until you can't answer something.
Gotcha.
And it used to be, medical school faculty used to think that was Socratic method, well, it's not.
Right.
Basically, the purpose was to put the student on the spot. They thought they were trying to really gauge the student's body of knowledge. It didn't work. An underlying motive was to haze the student and to let the student know that you're not as smart as you think you are. I'm much smarter than you. So pimping that's what that was.
Thank you.
It is, and it still is used. It's, I guarantee you,
Oh,
if you went
I'm
to
sure.
some of our clinics, I don't know, Will, did you ever have that happen to you in PA school?
Surgeons love pimping.
Yeah, yeah.
You'll be in an
They're
OR
surgeons.
case, and that's just all it is.
Right. Yeah, it's just a hazing process, and to let you know that you're not very smart. And
You
the
feel pretty good if you get it,
idea,
though.
what?
Pardon me?
You feel pretty good if you get it, though.
It can work to your
But
advantage.
it's pretty humiliating.
Yeah, no, it
Mostly
goes both
you get
ways.
Yeah,
humiliated.
it's not effective.
That shame-based model is so good for most people.
Yeah, it doesn't work, it doesn't help students learn, but that's not informal assessment.
And I'm not trying to be difficult, but pop quizzes is not an informal assessment because, let's say you do a pop quiz, but there's no grade attached. It's just for the student. You don't even pick it up necessarily.
Most of the time when pop quizzes are used, it's used to, people think that they're motivating students to master the
Be
material
prepared.
for class. You
Uh-huh.
could use pop quiz, like in team-based learning and classic team-based learning process, They're really not pop quizzes, they are quizzes.
Right.
And then you get feedback and all of that. That's a really good use of informal assessment.
But many pop quizzes are just for the point value, and
Yeah.
they're not tied
They're used to
to
their own.
improving
Yeah.
your
You
learning.
gotta pass this pop quiz. It's sort of, pop quizzes count so much toward your grade, but the student never gets any feedback about the pop quiz.
Right.
They think they're motivating students to learn.
To a lesser degree, assigning daily performance grades in clinics, same kind of thing. All right, if it's not tied, it's more of a summative assessment at that point. If it's not tied to formative, what do you do the next day? It's not as useful. Okay, there are other methods, other people that actually utilize a more Socratic questioning approach quite
Have
effectively.
completed the online examination of the NRP, and you provided me with your certificates over there. Thank you guys. Y'all completed and passed all sections. So what we're going to do here is just go over a scenario real quick of how you can use that knowledge that you've gotten through your examination and through your studying in a clinical setting, okay? So we're going to start with first scenario, okay? So I'm a doctor and I hand you a viable term infant. What is the first thing you're going to do is I hand you off this baby.
We're going to take it to the radiant warmer for a heat source and begin drying and stimulation.
So you take the baby. All right, so first thing you said was radiant warmer. So why are we trying to get this baby under a radiant warmer and with a heat source?
To not allow the baby to get cold. If they experience hypothermia, they can have hypoglycemia as a result of that.
And what causes the hypoglycemia? When they get hypothermia, what's causing the hypoglycemia?
The use of their glycogen stores.
Okay.
And these break those down
And they break those down. Why do you think they're breaking those glycogen storages down?
because they're trying to reduce their own heat.
Okay.
This is a really good example of Socratic method. The faculty members leading the student through the process of processing all the information, tying concepts together with facts. This is not pimping, because I'm not trying to but it's leading the student through the learning process and the reasoning process. It's a really good example of Socratic method.
Anyway, we can watch the rest of it, but you get the idea. You see she's asking questions. The questions are getting increasingly difficult and they're tied to information. Pretty useful way to assess learning and to assess what this person still needs. Okay. We're pretty close on time. I can't believe that. So, what'd you learn today, right? First question is.
What are the one or two things that you picked up from this that you might not have ever thought about before?
The difference between assessment and evaluation, although the terms have been used interchangeably, they're actually not the same.
Okay.
How,
Very good.
how informal assessment is very useful in teaching classroom settings, and how it can help improve the students, the learners' ability.
Yeah, and not only classroom setting, but the setting where you work. I think it's especially useful when you're working one-on-one with students. Other things that you picked up.
I appreciate the conversation about remediation and how so much of learning seems to be through a test, and that you don't get to